Welcome to California Wine Institute's Behind the Wines with our host, Elaine Chukan Brown. Thank you all for taking the time out to be with us today. So starting this week and through the month of September, California Wine Institute's Behind the Wine series will bring a regional focus to our continued exploration of the development of the Golden State's wine industry and its place on the world stage. Host Elaine will speak with leading authorities in wine media, education, hospitality, and science to weigh in on the state of California wine and offer insights about general perceptions on the subject in their respective communities. These conversations will highlight the exchanges between California and other great wine regions of the world, the common threads as well as the varied approaches to viticulture and winemaking. Today we welcome Jane Anson, who is currently based in Bordeaux. And before we get started, some housekeeping reminders for everyone. During the webinar, note that there are two communication methods available to participants. So there is the chat section and then the Q&A section. The chat section is an informal way for you to communicate with other participants. So just be sure to select everyone in the to field, as it can default to panelists only. And the Q&A section, and this is where we'd like you to submit your questions for Elaine and Jane to answer during the webinar. We will do our best to address your questions, and for those that are not answered live, we will provide in a Q&A summary in the email that you'll receive following the program. Now I'd like to introduce our panelists. Our host Elaine, in addition to writing for her own site, Waka Waka Wine Reviews, she serves as the American specialist for JancesRobinson.com and contributes to a long list of respected publications. She contributed to the 8th edition of the World Atlas of Wine, which has won multiple awards very recently, as well as the award-winning 4th edition of the Oxford Companion to Wine. She was named by the International Wine and Spirits Competition and Italy as one of the world's top 5 wine communicators of the year for the last 2 years in a row. And Jane is the author of Inside Bordeaux, Bordeaux Legends, among others, as well as co-author and translator of over a dozen wine and travel books, including Michelin Guide to the Wine Regions of France. She is Bordeaux correspondent and columnist for Decanter magazine and has won several awards for her writing, including the Prix Baron Philippe de Rothschild, Louis Roederer Wine Feature Writer of the Year, OIV Jury Prize, and a Born Digital Best Editorial. She is a graduate of the DUAD Tasting Diploma with the Bordeaux Institute of Oenology and an accredited wine teacher at the Bordeaux Ecole du Vin, with a master's in publishing from University College London. Now, Elaine, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Katie. Jane, it's so great to have you.
I'm really thrilled to be here with you.
Thank you. I'm so excited we were able to work this out because it's not, I think doing a series on California wine, it's easy to assume, oh, it'll all be producers. But I think talking about the relationship of Bordeaux and California and sort of the very different tracks they've each had in wine development is really quite an interesting story. And there literally is no one better to have that conversation with than you. So thank you for making time.
Thank you. I should be coming to California in about 6 weeks' time. So I'm glad that we're at least having an exchange, even if I can't get there in person.
Well, and you mentioned that you were getting ready, tasting a bunch of California wine this weekend too.
Yeah, yes. So this is the time of year that there's a bunch of Californian wines that are coming out through the Place de Bordeaux. So I've been spending the weekend tasting some fantastic wines, which will be sold through the Bordeaux Negociants next month.
Well, and so for people that are less aware of how things work there in Bordeaux, could you go ahead and explain what is the Place de Bordeaux and what is the significance of having your wine available on the Place de Bordeaux?
Sure. So the Place de Bordeaux is a kind of nebulous thing in some ways. There isn't an actual place. It's really the system of selling Bordeaux wine. And it goes back in one form or another for hundreds of years. But it has been historically really about Bordeaux wines themselves, to the exclusion really of all others, until really the late, well, I guess about 10 or 15 years ago, when started getting a couple of wines sold through the Place which were connected to Bordeaux owners. So you started off having Opus One, Senya, wines which were owned by a Bordeaux owner and co-owned with either Californian or Chilean And what happened was you'd use the same Bordeaux system. The interesting thing about the Bordeaux system and where it differs from California is most big brands in California, as you know, will have one or two specialist importers in each different market, or they will be selling direct through their own private members list. And, you know, it's very, very, very controlled. The system in Bordeaux is really the exact opposite, where the estates themselves produce their wine, but they're not responsible for selling it, and they hand it over to the merchants. And the skill of a Bordeaux merchant is that they kind of use the idea of competition. So you might have one estate making a ton of wine, and they will split that up between 20, 30, even 40 different merchants within Bordeaux. And then those merchants head out to the rest of the world. And some of them will be specialists in Asia, some of them in America, some of them in the UK. And each one of them will then give it to restaurants, on-trade, off-trade, private collectors. So you are getting an incredible penetration into the market at every different level. It can be confusing. It can add, for us as consumers, it can add a number of layers of price, but it's a very, very, very effective way of getting your brand out there in different markets and at different levels of the market. And that's the thing that now a lot of, well, not a lot, but there's maybe up to 40 now of icon wines around the world who are thinking, we want to get some of that expertise that the Bordeaux merchants can offer.
Right. So I know, speaking with producers here in California that are available on the Place de Bordeaux, it's quite clear it's really a big deal for them. And so it sounds like access to that expertise is a big part of why that's true, would you say?
Yeah, and I think what's been interesting for me as an observer is when it first happened. So when you got really Seigneur and Opus One, the Bordeaux chateaus didn't mind, you know, they're like, okay, this is a Rothschild wine, it's not a big deal.
Right.
But as you started getting more people coming on, when Massetto arrived, when these big Italian icon wines that weren't connected to Bordeaux, when they arrived, there was a definite feeling in Bordeaux of, hang on a minute, the negociants, they're our guys. What are they doing?
Right.
Time selling other people's wines. And there were a few standoffs, from what I understand, between the two sides. And I'm very glad that the Bordeaux merchants kind of stood their ground, because what it has done is shown, like you say, it's shown the expertise that the merchants have here, not connected to the chateaus, but in their own rights. And it also has helped the Bordelais chateaus realize just how good foreign icon wines are, international icon wines, selling their wines and knowing where they're going, being close to their consumers, following every step of the process. And I can really see now that the good Bordeaux chateaus are learning from the Californians and from the Argentinians and the people who are selling here about, they just really didn't have enough of a clue of who was drinking their wines in the end. And they've learned through the international wines what they should be doing.
Well, and I really see that, you know, you and I are both able to travel around the world, and I really see that around the world, that there's a steady improvement in learning how to sell wine and represent your own wine, but also in the quality of the wine. You can see it right away. I almost feel like at this point, I've tasted so much wine, I can almost taste in the wine if the producer, you know, is aware of the world of wine, rather than only their own or their local wine. You know, there's just a difference in character in the wine itself even, which I think is amazing. So, but I really appreciate your point that Bordeaux, you know, Bordeaux is one of the world's icons, you know, for wine regions. And so the idea that Bordeaux is learning from this, being shown these international wines is really quite a significant point too. But is there a limit on how someone gets into the Place de Bordeaux? Do they limit who's brought in, and how does that work?
The Place is a loose collection of merchants. Really, there is not one person who is governing what happens in the Place, what are the rules, etc. It's a collection of individual merchant houses, and there are some which are particularly strong and powerful and some which are smaller. And what you find is it's the big guys who are smart and forward looking, who are going to, as far as I understand it, going to the icon wines, going to people in Napa and pitching what they can do. And it's, you know, that's how it's worked out. But what it seems to be is that most of these big overseas wines, Inglenook, etc., where they might have had a single importer into France, a single importer into the UK, they will pick maybe 5 or 6 Bordeaux merchants, so on the Place, and they will be responsible for all of the distribution outside of the US, which is really a big change.
Right.
So not only did they have to kind of, the negociants had to convince the estates to take them on, and then they also were pissing off quite a few distributors around the world who were used to having exclusive access to Inglenook or whatever in their own field, in their own market, and they don't have that anymore. So I don't think it was easy, but it has definitely worked out well so far. But we're now on about 35 to 40 wines. This year, for the first time, there's a lot of, not a lot, but 5 big Australian wines coming on board. So I think it's a brilliant positive move, but I wonder how big can it get? There's got to be a point at which they've got to stop.
Yeah, because there has to be enough hands-on, the ability to be hands-on, it sounds like. So let's go ahead and look at some maps though, because we're talking about Bordeaux, we're talking about California. So let's just go ahead and look at the broad maps to see where in the world we're talking about, because we do have viewers literally from all over the world on right now. And so, of course, California, we're going to talk about 3 wines from California today that are represented on the Place de Bordeaux. And this California map has a large box because we'll talk about a wine from Napa, a wine from Sonoma, and a wine from Paso Robles. A lot of people assume that, California Cabernet is all in Napa. And one of the things I am excited to do today is talk about how actually it moves around the state. But then, of course, you're located there in Bordeaux. And so we need to see, okay, where is that in France? Just to help give context to the conversation as well. And we'll talk more in depth about some of these regions in a moment as well. If we could see so you can see Bordeaux in, we haven't demarcated France, but it's relatively southwest in France. And then if we zoom in, one of the key features, of course, is the river. And a lot of these areas, in Bordeaux that we talk about that are really iconic for what we classically call Bordeaux varieties, really are in that kind of the alluvial benchland soils there, high draining gravelly soils. And then here, of course, in California, Cabernet really gets started in, again, these really gravelly benchland soils along the Napa River. So there are parallels there in sort of how California gets started with Cabernet and how Bordeaux really is defined. But for you, traveling in both regions, you of course see really important differences. So if you had to briefly comment on where are there parallels, where are there differences, just with a few points, what would you draw out?
Well, one of the things that's quite interesting to note in Bordeaux compared to Napa is that although Cabernet is very much seen as being a dominant grape variety and an icon variety, it is mainly located, that map was great actually, it's mainly located in that corridor that we saw that had Pauillac, Saint-Julien, Saint-Estèphe, Margaux. It really is in one small peninsula. Mm-hmm. Yeah, if you look at that, we see here Bordeaux, Pessac-Léognan, and Saint-Emilion, Pomerol. Those areas don't have so much Cabernet. Pessac does, but really the Saint-Emilion, Pomerol don't. And it's because the soils are so different over there. Bordeaux is very much led by planting where the soils, as you say, there's this kind of alluvial, lots of gravel. That's really where Cabernet is. So it actually only forms a relatively small 25% about of the whole plantings of Bordeaux. And Merlot is a far more dominant grape here. Not psychologically yeah. Cabernet is, but when you actually look at the plantings, because the right bank, as you see where Saint-Emilion and Pomerol is a much bigger area, and there's a lot more Merlot there. So that's quite different. Whereas in Napa, I think really Cabernet, from my perception, and you correct me, Cabernet really does dominate. Certainly it has the same psychological dominance, but also the very big wines in Cabernet, the real icons, are almost always Cabernet dominant. Whereas here in Bordeaux, you have wines like Petrus, they're Merlot, 100% Merlot. You have quite a few of the very, very big, expensive icon wines in Bordeaux that don't contain Cabernet Sauvignon. So I would say that's one of the big differences.
Yes, no, I think that's a really great point. And I think we should go ahead and start looking at the first wine that we're going to talk about today with that in mind. And so that is Inglenook from Rutherford, which of course is, the Rutherford benchland soils really become historically California's, like, the discovery that, oh my God, this is perfect land for Cabernet, so Andrei Chelychev, of course, super important historically, points out, the Rutherford bench are preeminent soils for Cabernet. And it's important to note though, that at the time, the Rutherford bench was understood as the entire benchland area that goes from below Yountville to above St. Helena. Now we've demarcated smaller areas, and so there is an area only called Rutherford. And Inglenook Rubicon really is within the benchland soils that are now in Rutherford. But I just want to point out that historically, that bench that Chelachev referenced with the high draining gravelly loam soil so perfect for Cabernet, that actually runs from Yountville all the way up through St. Helena.
Because that really does make it more of a link to the Medoc of this kind of the expanse. And the other thing that's really, really fascinating about that area, this was being discovered, you know, by Nibam in the 19th century, so like 1880s. That's not so dissimilar to when Cabernet was really being discovered in Bordeaux. We have this image that everything in Bordeaux has been here for 2,000 years, which a lot of the winemaking has. But Cabernet only really took off after the 1855 classification, you know, towards the end of the 19th century. So there are real similarities about what was happening in Napa and Bordeaux at the same time.
Well,
and I think something we don't think about very often.
Yeah, I really appreciate you bringing that out, because you're absolutely right. We tend to think of Bordeaux as if it had it all figured out forever and we came up on its heels. But Inglenook, as you said, you know, was really, had Cabernet towards the late 1800s, but also was experimenting with lots of other varieties. And actually was, if you look at historic texts from the 1800s, Inglenook is regularly mentioned because it was one of the vineyards that was discovering what does grow well in these areas and what can really elevate to, you know, the best in the state. And so this is actually a really interesting wine. Inglenook, of course, again, classic Cabernet, you know, one of the more well-known wineries for the state. But 13 is a unique vintage in that generally this wine is a blend, but for 13, actually, it's 100% Cabernet. And so there's so many things I could say about this wine, but I'd love for you to start and talk about, you know, how you there in France, how does this wine read to you? And how does a wine like this also read in a place like Bordeaux?
Well, one of the things that is so wonderful about us tasting this particular vintage of Inglenook is that we were now 2 years into the guy who is now the director of winemaking, Philippe Bascol, having come over and joined Inglenook from Chateau Margaux. So he was very much tasked when he was brought over there with introducing, slightly sculpting it a little bit more, you know, bringing a slightly more European style, which was very much Inglenook's origins. That was what Gustave Nibam stated he wanted when he found it. Apparently he did go to Bordeaux and pick up some grapes from them. I haven't seen the documentation, but that's what I'm told, that's what he did. So this is, you know, 2013 is a big vintage in Napa, a brilliant, fantastic vintage. But I love tasting this wine, which to me is a very classic, gorgeous Cabernet. Really, for me, it sums up what Cabernet can do in Napa.
Yes.
And I can see the influence of Philippe not being afraid to just take his foot off the pedal a little bit, to have all of that beautiful ripeness and richness and texture that you get from a Napa Cab, but also keeping a little bit of freshness, even in such a big year as 2013. So I love that about this wine.
The thing I love about 2013 for Napa Valley, just in general, it's such a structural year, so that there was a lot of room actually for producers to choose. Do they want to go big or do they want to pull back? Because this, no matter what, the structure was going to be there and they could kind of build the size around it. And for a lot of 13s, you really have to let them stay in bottle because that tannin needs to kind of resolve and allow the flavors to open up a little bit. But this Inglenook, it's so incredibly aromatic, really, really gorgeous, complex aromatics, and then so much energy and freshness, as you were saying, in the palate too. But it also, in my mind, really, it shows off those benchland soils. I can taste that it's from that western Napa Valley near the Mayacamas, which is thrilling too.
This also, so this wine for me encapsulates why today there is no question within Bordeaux itself that Napa is given the respect that it wasn't given in the 1976 tasting at the time of the Judgment of Paris, etc. Today, so Philippe Bascol had come over from Chateau Margaux to work at Inglenook. Now he'd been for a long time kind of a technical director, quality control, etc. at Margaux, who'd been working there for over 20 years, but he was not well known in France. He really wasn't, because you had Paul Pontellier being the director of Chateau Margaux. And I knew that he was incredibly talented, Philippe Bascol, but it wasn't the case that it was widely known. He made his name by coming to Inglenook, and he now is back at Chateau Margaux as director. And there is another similar example. At Opus One, you had Jean-Philippe Danjois, who was at Opus for, I think, about a decade, and then came back to Bordeaux, worked at Clerc Milan, and now this year has just gone over to Chateau Mouton Rothschild, same ownership. But that means that we have two first growths in Bordeaux, Mouton and Margaux, who are being headed up by people who made their name in the Napa Valley. And they're both French, but I think that's really cool and a real sign that I'm not sure we have talked about enough globally, you know, generally, of just how far that relationship between Napa and Bordeaux has come, that it is a true meeting of equals today.
Yeah, which it's thrilling to know that, but also that, you know, California is excited to have that French influence, but then also that the space is there for the learning that's made and the reputation that's made here in California to then actually be seen as relevant there in Bordeaux. Do you see any changes in how, you know, knowledge people are bringing back from these adventures abroad, so to speak?
So very fun talking to Philippe at Inglenook. One of the things he said that when he got to Napa, he had to stop himself from kind of thinking through his process out loud, because in France he felt able to say, so I'm considering maybe, you know, changing the number of bunches on whatever he'd be discussing, some viticultural thing. And in France, nobody would do anything until he said do it. But he said in Napa, people were so great, they're so on it. They're just like, right, okay, I'm going to do it. So he said as he talked through things, people would be off doing it before he'd really decided. So he had to really rein himself in. What he absolutely learned from Napa was he's a far better presenter of his wines, of talking about, you know, putting the wines out there, being a figurehead. All that stuff is incredibly important. But the way that people work together, the way that teams kind of collaborate is much, from my experience and from what I've heard from him and from Jean-Philippe Danjois, Jean-Emmanuel, sorry, is that the collaboration is much more effective in Napa. And I know when Jean-Emmanuel came back from Opus to Clerc Milan, he changed the way everything was worked. So previously there were the vineyard team, there was the cellar team, there was, you know, the office team, and nobody really connected to each other. And he really changed that so that everybody followed things from beginning to end, so that people had a much greater sense of ownership of what was happening in the vineyard. And that was something that he says he learned and brought back from Napa.
Yes, we see that quite a bit here, actually. There's a lot of people more and more over time realizing having every aspect of their team understand every other aspect is actually really increases the commitment and the loyalty to their own work, but also the knowledge. So like as one example, at Frog's Leap, every person that's part of the team has to work in every job at different points. So even office people will have vineyard time. And
what Jean-Emmanuel did at Clerc Milan, which he must have brought back from Napa.
But then also, you know, we had an episode last week with Corey Empting at Harlan, and a different kind of example there. They've really put a lot of work into bringing their vineyard team into the technical knowledge of, you know, what pests could be an issue, how does the effect show up, how might you see it, or with disease pressures, or with wood diseases, but also just general care and quality. So they're actually giving the vineyard workers themselves this kind of knowledge so they can make the decisions in collaboration with the rest of the team. And so it's another kind of level of collaboration, because vineyard workers are the ones that have the most time and contact with the vines. And so by giving them knowledge and working with them, it kind of increases everybody's knowledge.
I always think any estate that doesn't have the vineyard workers come in to taste the wine once it's been finished is, it's such a key part. And I'm always amazed by how many don't do that. They don't get their vineyard workers in to taste the final wine.
Yes, so, Yeah, I agree with you. So let's go ahead and look at the Sonoma wine too. So one of the things I always say is, you know, one of California's genuine wine contributions to the world is mountain Cabernet.
Yeah.
You know, as we saw in the map, you know, Bordeaux is, you know, heavily influenced by the river, but there were no mountain formations on either side of the river as we're used to here in California. And so in the 1970s, these kind of, at the time, young gun winemakers move into the mountains and start making Cabernet in a completely different environment than traditionally was thought of for the variety. So totally different soils, totally different sorts of microclimates. Now suddenly everything's on a slope side. And so the second wine that we've selected, Verite, it's again Cabernet-based wine, but very much slopes and mountaintops, but from Sonoma County. And I think one of the really important things to get at here is that people are very used to thinking about Napa Valley in relation to Cabernet, but I know you've spent time tasting Cabernet in Sonoma as well. You know, Sonoma really has quite incredible Cabernet sites. And the thing about, you can see the pin drop there, it's actually still the Mayacamas, which are famous in the Napa Valley side of things, but actually Sonoma County has half of the Mayacamas, so to speak. It's just facing the other direction. And so very similar soils is what you would find in Napa, but on the Sonoma side.
I visited this property last time I was in California. And it really kind of brought home to me what another difference between California and Bordeaux in terms of what you do with the varieties. So here they're making three main cuvées, main bottlings, using the traditional Bordeaux grapes, but they're not afraid to isolate them. And so you have one cuvée which is Cabernet dominant, which we're tasting, one which is Cabernet Franc dominated, one which is Merlot dominant. And that's so great because you're really making a link between the terroir, between the soils, and what impact does that kind of sense of place within the vineyard have. That is happening more and more in Bordeaux, but that's been like that for so long in Bordeaux, in California. Whereas what tends to happen here is that you would blend them all together. So that for me is something that I find exciting when I'm tasting over in California, is to kind of tease out what happens when you have Cabernet at 100% or at 90%.
Well, and this is an interesting wine too, in terms of, and I'm curious to hear your perspective on this. You know, Bordeaux in a way is sort of defined by a tradition of blending. But here in California, and with this wine in particular, the blending is taken to yet another step in that its multiple vineyards are blended as well. And so, you know, how does that idea, so it's multiple varieties in this case, but also multiple vineyards, all within Sonoma County. But how does that sort of idea, you know, how is it perceived there in Bordeaux? Is there very much of that done? Is it unusual?
Yeah, Pierre Sayon, who makes this wine, he's famous even in Bordeaux for isolating, for having, I think, maybe 15 different origins of forest for his barrels, and really different toasting for the barrels, you know, all different, all kinds of things, different grain of the woods. And he very much isolates it and sees it through from beginning to end in Bordeaux as well as in Sonoma. But I would say that he's quite unusual in taking it to that level of detail. I think that's probably true in California as well. He is a particularly interesting winemaker intellectually for really going down to the granular level of what is the marriage between oak and grape variety, and site and grape variety. So yes, it's quite unusual in Bordeaux, but I think he stands out for that in California as well. One thing that's quite interesting to note about this in terms of the evolution of the relationship is they founded this wine in, I think, 1988, before they bought the place in Bordeaux. So he's French, he's not from Bordeaux, but he's from Southwest France. And this estate got its start in California at least 10 years before they bought in Saint-Emilion. So now he has a beautiful place, Chateau Obaii. It's owned by Jackson Family Wines, but he's the winemaker for both. And we're now seeing again some of the things that he's learned from California, like this isolation of different plots of the vineyard against different specific barrels, which again is stuff that he started there and has brought over to Bordeaux.
Right.
So It's a big trend in Bordeaux to do more and more plot site isolation, but we're still a long way from, even in terms of the laws of what you're allowed to do, we're a long way from where you guys are in California.
Well, and this, you know, again, it's a beautiful wine, and it's really, it's so fascinating to me too to taste it because, you know, so this is the 2016 vintage, which is really in a lot of ways, I think, for Cabernet in the north coast of California, sort of a perfect year. There's the 2013 is one of my personal favorite vintages, and I honestly believe it's one of the strongest vintages in a few decades even. But it's also so structural that for some people, there's too much structure. 16 I see as
some 2013 cabs from Napa. I do sometimes find them, they're so big, I can, you know, I find it tough.
Yeah, so the 16 is, as a vintage overall, is really a beautiful balance of structure and flesh, so to speak. And the tannin is a little more fine grained than we tend to see in 13s. But tasting the Verite now is after the Inglenook is fascinating because there's a way in which the Inglenook speaks with one clear, upright voice. And the Verite has sort of a constellation of characteristics, and it's more of a symphony of, you know, so the sound all is in harmony, but there's lots of different little sounds that bring it together. And so there's a way in which I can really feel that it's a multi-site blend, but in a unified wine. Yeah. You know, but it also
it's a high level of cab. It's not so different, but I agree with you. The expression is totally different. The Inglenook is much more the classic, close your eyes, here I am, with Cabernet from California, from Napa.
Well, and but the Verite, I think, also gets at a question that's coming in from Yuki, you know, that when we move from a region like Burgundy, where there's so much emphasis in the conversation, at least on place, and blending is not common at the high level wine, and especially in relation to variety. But then in Bordeaux, blending is part of the effort. And there's a sense in which it shifts that relationship of place and winemaker. And so one of the questions that Yuki's asking is just, you know, how does a wine like Verite, but also how does a place like Bordeaux kind of shift its attention to the importance of the winemaker compared to the expression of the place? How does that relationship show up?
I love that question, but on so many different levels, because I think it's one of the ways in which Bordeaux gets unfairly stigmatized for not caring about place, which is this fact that it's a blended wine. So if we just take Burgundy as one example, there is no question that Burgundy does a lot more isolation of individual soils, but as you quite rightly pointed out, it's still a blend of different plots within a vineyard. It's a single grape variety. So you see it translated through one single variety, but they are still vineyards where the guy who's making the wine is making choices about how do I treat this vine over on the left-hand side of my vineyard differently from the one on the right, because the slope's different, the aspect's different, the amount of water it's getting, all those things are different. And that's what terroir is, you know, how does this particular individual site react to the person who is making the wine and making those choices? Those two things don't change. That, you know, terroir is also the person making the wine. So if we switch over to Bordeaux, Bordeaux is a big area, and there are a lot of very different soil types here. I mean, there's so many. It's such a fractured region. I'm saying with California, there's so many different types of soils. That's why we blend different varieties here. It's not for like a shortcut of making sure there's like a guarantee that something ripens in a particular year. It's because the Cabernet Sauvignon will not ripen on clay, so you've got to pick Merlot. I mean, I'm being obviously, it's much more complicated than that, but they're making choices because they actually are looking at their soil, and they're making choices that are very much determined by the terroir. So I think that Bordeaux, we jump too quickly to think that it isn't about terroir here, but it is. And in fact, the reason that it's blended is a reflection of just how complicated the terroir is in Bordeaux, rather than how simple the attitude is.
No, I think that I thank you for talking through that so clearly, because there's a way in which the wine conversation around the world has really elevated the notion of a single vineyard wine and a single variety wine, and as if that's the purest expression. and that sort of leads into people thinking of blending almost as a kind of trick, but actually really blending is an art on its own. And it actually, in the kind of work that you're talking about and that we see here in Verite, and that I know you see there in Bordeaux, it's really actually speaks to the winemaker being profoundly in tune with the nuances of their place. And so it's just a very different relationship to place, rather than a focus only on the winemaker.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's exactly well summed up.
One of the things that that I know you had mentioned in previous conversations you wanted us to be sure to address is the idea of climate change and how Bordeaux and California are each dealing with that. And it's a really interesting question too, because you don't have the option of irrigation there in Bordeaux, so it forces a different sort of thoughtfulness in the vineyard. Unfortunately, I mean, I'll start the question by clarifying what's happening currently in California. Unfortunately, now with California, it turns out that in addressing the question of climate change, we have to be honest about fires. And so I'm going to just, some of the questions coming in are about how things are going in California right now in relation to current fires. So there are fires in California and actually in quite a few parts of the state. In relation to proximity to places we know as wine regions, there are fires in Santa Cruz Mountains, in Monterey, in Napa, and in Sonoma. And the thing and let me be honest, they're quite difficult to be dealing with. But at the same time, I want to clarify that these fires are all in wilderness areas. So they're outside, very much outside population centers. That's not to say there are not people impacted, because there are, but the fires are all happening in wilderness areas. So there are comparatively few people living within those areas. And that also actually means they're, for the most part, outside wine regions as well. And so one of the big questions, and that is also being asked about actually by Yuki again, is the question of smoke taint. And so currently, as things are, Nicolini here in Napa Valley, which is one of the iconic historic wineries that's been here since the 1800s, the original building is intact. They did have an out cabin that was damaged by the fire, but the winery is intact. And then there's been a few places where some vineyards have been burned, but in terms of actual winery structures, there's just Nicolini lost a cabin on the fringes of the fires. And we know from 17 that vineyards often form fire breaks and that stop fires from advancing. We've been seeing that again. So it doesn't mean that those sort of outer edge vineyards won't be damaged, but it does mean they'll stop the fire from advancing further. And so we've been seeing that again. The big question though that Yuki's asking and that other people are wondering about is smoke taint. And California is actually, alongside Australia, has become one of the world's leading experts on smoke taint. And the current understanding, I spent some time yesterday looking into this with research at UC Davis. And the current understanding actually is that smoke taint is caused by volatile aromatic compounds in the smoke itself, rather than by particulates in the smoke. But those volatile compounds are actually quite fragile. And so they dissipate after about 24 hours. And so smoke taint does not happen just from smoke being in the air. It actually happens from proximity and time in relation to the origin of the fire. And so people are being very, very conscientious here in California. Harvest is still going on in all regions of California, actually. And I spent yesterday and the day before kind of going around tasting fruit, talking to people about what they were harvesting and what they were seeing. And actually, some people are already bringing reds in, and a lot of people are doing kind of 5-gallon bucket tests where they're harvesting a little bit and pressing that to see, is there smoke taint in the juice? And actually things look, relatively speaking, pretty hopeful. So I think the fruit quality, coming into this harvest for 2020, the fruit quality has been unbelievably pristine. That was something I've been seeing this last week. The fruit quality is just, everything is gorgeous coming in. And so if what we're describing is true, then we have a chance of having actually still a really beautiful vintage. And people are being quite conscientious about smoke.
Are there some reds reaching maturity already before the end of August?
Yeah, well, so earlier yesterday, I visited a site in Eastern Napa, about halfway up the valley, and they went ahead and brought their Merlot in. They would have waited about 5 more days or a week, so they would have been bringing it in more like early September, but they decided that it was worth bringing it in a little earlier than planned, just to ensure that they didn't have issues later. So Cabernet, of course, comes in much later, and so we'll have to wait and see how that goes. But the most Chardonnay has been brought in already. Sauvignon Blanc has been brought in already. Sparkling wines, of course, and we just have to wait and see on the rest of the fruit. It's just too early to know. But so hopefully that helps clarify some things.
Yes. Thank you for asking that question, because I was also, we were chatting about that before, and I'm also, obviously, all of us around the world are watching and for so many reasons, hoping that you guys are all okay, and that the vineyard can, that the vintage can continue. So thank you for updating for us in Bordeaux.
Yeah, so I'll just do one more quick answer to a question Timothy's asking. So one of the things is, if fruit does get smoke taint, then the thing that can work is if people press it off the skins and kind of let that first juice sort of drain out, and then take the rest of the juice. They can make rosé or white wine generally, because the smoke taint doesn't usually penetrate into the meat of the fruit. It's generally just on the skins. So if you can get the juice off the skins, you can usually make a really lovely rosé. But again,
good point there, that it does mean you can't make a red, because you need,
if it's in the skins. So but let's go back to the broader question. I know you've seen a lot of the vineyard choices really evolving and changing there in Bordeaux in relation to temperature change. And so what are some examples of how people are addressing with the kind of change in weather patterns there?
Yeah, so I would love to hear from you as an exchange really about this, because in Bordeaux, they are limited by the fact that right now there are 6 allowable, if we just stick to reds, 6 allowable red varieties. And so what they can't do, which they would have much more ability to do in California, is to field graft and just put an entirely different variety which is more resistant to hot summers. They don't have that option. So sticking within the Bordeaux varieties, there are questions of whether or not to introduce new varieties happening right now, but that is not for the Pauillacs, the Centimillions, the Margots of this world. It's for the entry-level Bordeaux Superiors. And even that hasn't been decided till 2021. So if we just stick with classic varieties in the big estates, what we're finding is it's viticulture that people are looking at, and it is increasing the percentages of the smaller grapes, which maybe people had forgotten about. So a lot more Malbec is coming through, a lot more Carmenère, a lot more Petit Verdot. And particularly Malbec, it had almost been forgotten about really in Bordeaux. It was big in the 19th century, complicated to get fully right, certainly in the old climate. And now we're seeing, especially on the right bank, a lot of Malbec coming back. So people are using what they can, which is the allowable varieties, and finding the ones which work better. And also, because we're not allowed irrigation here, although that again is a question that people are starting to think, do we need it? Particularly for some white wines and young vines, you're already allowed it, but only till 3 years old. So there are some questions going on, and will we allow irrigation? But because that's not allowed at the moment, roots tend to be deeper in Bordeaux than they would be in California. And that does give some resistance, obviously, to the hot summers, because already the roots are going deeper to get their nutrients. So that's helpful. But the same questions I'm sure that you're having, that for a long time, canopies were being raised to get as much photosynthesis, as much sugar to the grapes as possible. That was really happening in the 1990s to 2000s, the Parker years. And now people are reducing their canopies down because they don't want to get too much sugar. They're trying to kind of control the amount of alcohols that are coming into the wines. So we're seeing, these kind of viticultural choices. It is super interesting. And the Florence and Daniel Catillard of Smith Oak Lafitte here have just bought, as you know, Flora Springs in California. They bought at the beginning of the year. They've had a terrible year, obviously, as everyone has in terms of travel. So I don't think they've actually been to California since they signed on the dotted line. because first you had, obviously COVID travel restrictions, and then we have fires now, and it's very difficult to get to California. So they haven't been. But I was talking to Daniel about exactly this question, and he said that they're looking into putting, you'll know this better than me because we do not have that here, but like a hail net, but it's a net to stop the sunlight coming through.
Yes. Yeah. So one of the things California has developed, actually, which I believe comes out of research that was originally done in Marlborough, New Zealand, and then high elevation Uco Valley in Argentina, is actually shade netting. And so part of the original development of...
It's not shade netting. There's a really cool name, but I can't remember it.
Yeah, so I'm not sure the other name, but shade netting was originally developed. People were trying to understand, like Marlborough and Uco Valley actually have unusually high levels of UV. And so they were trying to understand the impact of UV on the flavor and ripeness development of a vine. And so they developed the ability to create shade netting at different densities to kind of block out proportions of UV light and do side-by-side viticultural experiments to see what was the effect on the fruit. So anyway, there are some areas here in California that will use shade netting if they have an especially exposed vineyard. It's not super common, actually. And one of the other things I want to say too,
about the temperature. Does it not raise the temperature under that?
Well, so that's one of the things everybody has to work out. So the thing that I've actually seen more commonly here in California, rather than something like shade netting, is, historically people have used VSP, which keeps the canopy very vertically. People here in California are realizing that it's better to allow the canopy to spread. So it creates a natural shade. Yeah, natural shade on the fruit zone under where the leaves are. But actually the thing we found here is that even more importantly, it creates a sort of respiration zone. So the vines, as they respire, it creates a sort of airflow under the canopy, but it also creates shade on the ground itself. So it cools the soil temperature, which directly impacts sort of the speed at which the vine is ripening. So previously we thought of this is all about literal fruit exposure of sun and temperature, but we're actually finding that the soil temperature, which thereby influences sort of the shallow root temperature, that actually has an impact on how fast the vine ripens as well. So here in California, you were distinguishing between the kind of high level, high quality houses and then sort of the bigger volume production. And in terms of irrigation, that's a really important distinction too, because when we're talking about kind of the high quality, high level houses in California, they're actually really not relying on irrigation. It's legally allowed, but a lot of them actually are not using it except after harvest, when they sort of want to say, oh, thank you to the vines, and they'll give them a big dose of water after all the fruit's off. But during the season, it's actually far less common for people to irrigate. The big thing about irrigation too is it all comes down to timing. So people will still do some irrigation if it's a drought year with some heat, then they'll often drop some water just before a heat spell, just to help vines get through. Because the big thing we haven't brought up yet is that we don't get rain in the summer and Bordeaux does, and so that's part of why irrigation's allowed here. But the biggest change I've actually seen is people are moving to keeping cover crops year round. That again lowers soil temperature because cover crops are lighter, literally just lighter in color than soil itself. And then also again, opening the canopy to do respiration zone. But I want to make sure we're keeping track of time, and I'm excited about this third wine because it really speaks to some of the freedom California has to explore different ideas. And I think too, kind of gets back at how California has influenced France. Sometimes people come here where there aren't the varietal restrictions, they're able to play. And it's not that they bring back the same varietal mix to France, but I know that it just changes their way of thinking what can be done. So this third wine, if we could see the Paso map, we've actually gone all the way down into the Central Coast. La Aventure is an estate there. And what I want to really make sure we understand is that if you look at this map here, you can see the vineyard is tucked far west in Paso Robles into the mountains in what's called the Willow Creek district. And this area is quite interesting in that it's sort of in an air chute within the mountains of the coastal range there in Paso Robles. And so there's a cooling breeze that moves through this whole region because of it. And And the soils there are really have quite a lot of calcareous rock, actually. A lot of people forget that California actually has limestone as well. And so La Aventura is actually planted in an area that is it's a mix of different shale types, some of which are calcareous, and also in a relatively speaking cooler area of Paso. A lot of times people assume Paso is only very hot, and this is actually quite a comparatively cooler area. But what's really unique about this wine, if we could see the wine slide, is it is a Bordeaux inspired wine that actually includes a significant portion of Syrah. And again, this wine is represented on the Place de Bordeaux. So I would love to hear you comment on how is a wine like this that scandalously includes Rhone varieties with Bordeaux varieties, how is something like this received?
So I don't expect that many Bordeaux winemakers will have tried this wine, honestly, and they should do, because I love this wine. And the guy who, as you know, Stephen, the guy who owns it, he made wine in Bordeaux for a long time. He owned 3 properties here, one in Bordeaux, one in Castillon, one in AOC Bordeaux, one in Castillon, one in Saint-Emilion, and then got sick of the restrictions. He wasn't from a winemaking family. I think he was born in Paris, and he basically bugged his parents when he was a teenager to learn more about wine, and they thought he would get over it, and then he didn't get over it, and he came and studied wine first in Burgundy and then came over to Bordeaux. But after 15 years here, got sick of the restrictions that the appellation contrôlée system would have, of you're only allowed your 6th variety and you can only do this amount of yield and this amount of alcohol, and etc. So he moved over to California and founded this wine. And I'm sure that he decided, right, now I am free, I'm going to go for the wine, the great varieties that I want. And so has this Syrah Cabernet blend, which I'm sure you agree, it's delicious. It
is, yeah.
It's gorgeous. And in Bordeaux, there are 2 or 3 wines that do a Syrah Cabernet blend. They're called Vin de France. They're not allowed to be bottled as Bordeaux, but they happen to be from very big names. So La Lagune has a property in the Rhone and here in Margaux, well, in Haut-Médoc, but just outside of Margaux. And she makes, Caroline Frey, she makes a blend of a Syrah and a Cabernet. And then you have Les Velescas, one of the big wines from Saint-Julien. The winemaker there, a guy called Philippe Graffoy, he makes his own wine, which is a blend called l'Odyssée, which is also on the Place de Bordeaux, which is a Syrah and Cabernet blend. And then the third one that I can think of is Chateau Palmer. So one of the
Wow.
great wines of Bordeaux. They do, actually under the label Chateau Palmer, they do a Syrah Cabernet blend, which goes back to the idea that in the 19th century, it was more typical. It was more common to have a blend of those 2 varieties that you just don't get today. So it's a great wine. It's delicious. And it kind of speaks to the history. If we're talking about our particular conversation here, it does speak in fact to the history of Bordeaux and the Rhone.
Well, which is so interesting. I think people are profoundly unaware of that history that you just described, but it's exciting to hear about. And the thing that I love about this wine too, it's got that really very fine grained tannin, but it's firm tannin, but it's very fine grained. And it has that, like what I think of as Cabernet's very upright character, but then the juicy, fresh, mouth-watering presence of the Syrah. And so you get this kind of extra dose.
Wilting aromatics that you're really getting from the Syrah, which is so beautiful.
Yeah. It's super fun. It's just really fun to see the combination brought together here. And also, that's one of the things that I really appreciate about Paso Robles is people are really feeling free to experiment with, what they're growing and how they bring different varieties together. And I think that's, Paso Robles has definitely come into being better known, but I think in a lot of other ways, it's been a frontier for wine growing for a long time. And there's a sense of freedom that you can find in a frontier where people can really say, no, what is going to be best here? We don't just have to emulate other places. And especially when a newer region doesn't have the same scrutiny that a high level region does. There's plenty of experimentation going on in Napa, and at the same time, it's harder to get away with it there because there's more scrutiny because it's better known.
I think that's a brilliant, brilliant point. And in fact, when I'm in Napa, that's quite often one of the things that winemakers will say, which is that there is such a pressure to make an icon cab in Napa. If you're wanting to launch a great wine, if you're wanting to kind of get media attention, etc., the pressure is to have a brilliant Cabernet. And so there is less freedom, as you must get in Sonoma, in Paso Robles, to be able to really follow your heart as well and to kind of have fun with it.
Yes. So one of the things, we are almost out of time, but I want to make sure if you could comment a little bit more on just how, you know, there's so much more ownership that of French families honestly buying properties here in California, especially in Napa, of course, but also elsewhere. And so could you speak a little bit to how you're seeing that sort of interest evolve over time?
Sure. And also, can I just point out that everyone watching, you can see that I'm in Europe, and that the day is,
yeah.
And now, like, so this is a time zone thing that it's getting darker here. Anyway, yes, I think, so the first high profile kind of movement from France into California was with Baron Philippe de Rothschild when they kind of came together in 1979 to do the launch of this with Robert Mondavi. And then the next big name would be coming to Dominus, would be Christian Moex coming to Dominus 1982. And that kind of chugged along at that level for a while. And in the last 5 years, we've had an explosion of Bordeaux estate owners who are going to Napa. Just to get my dates right, because I wrote it so I'd get all the dates right. So we have Francois Pinault from Chateau Latour coming to Arajo in 2013. We have Alan and Gerard Wertheimer of Rosen Segler and Cannon, bought Saint-Supéry 2015. Ponte Canet bought Pimrai, they renamed Pimrai in 2016. Christian Moex then bought another estate, Ulysses, in 2008. Oh, and then in Sonoma, a lovely couple here, Claire and Gonzague Lawton, who work biodynamically in some really brilliant estates in Bordeaux. They own Acaibo in Sonoma, 2012. Rothschilds we've done. Florence and Daniel Catillard just this year at Flora Springs, renaming Catillard Family Estates. And then Lafite, even Lafite Rothschild back in really the 80s and 90s had a shareholding in Chalone, one of my favorite Californian wines, by the way, the Chalone Chardonnay, just love it so much. Anyway, they were part of that until 2004. So we've had quite a lot. But one of the things I wanted to talk about was the fact that it's also gone the other way, and increasingly the other way. And that is where, again, we see this really great mutual respect and kind of cross-pollination between the two regions. So specifically from California, I wanted to mention 3 estates. Chateau Obaii. Chateau Obaii is owned by an American family who actually originally are from the East Coast, the Wilmers, but it today is being headed up by Chris Wilmers, and he teaches at Santa Cruz University. He's a specialist in big cats at Santa Cruz University. There's a guy called Sean Bishop who owns JJ Buckley in San Francisco. He has his own pretty small estate in Castillon, which is called Côte de Ray. And that's really interesting because he's a small guy. I can see we're literally at the end of time. And then Stephen and Denise Adams, who own Adams Estate in Howell Mountain, and they have Pompagard in Santa Milian. So there are other Americans, but those are the 3 Californians I just wanted to mention. And it's just, yeah, I just really love that that exchange. And I love going to Pompagard because I can get a glass of their Sauvignon Blanc from Howell Mountain.
Oh, that's so fun. That's really fun. So we are about out of time, but I have to ask one more thing. You know, your previous book, I will have to say, so this Inside Bordeaux, it's completely brilliant. So this is Jane's book that just came out this year, and I highly recommend it. I'm going to honestly say this is one of the best wine books that's come out in very, very long time. And it's really speaks to your thoroughgoing relationship to the region and your knowledge of the region. But also your previous book, Wine Revolution, was really all about organic and biodynamic wine growing and winemaking around the world. And so just very briefly as a last question, can you comment on how do you see interest in that sort of wine growing shifting there in Bordeaux, and what have you noticed in California?
Well, I think what's happening here is going hand in hand with this renewed interest in the terroir that we were talking about before. I think once you start truly focusing on your vineyard and understanding the relationship between that vineyard and what we're finally getting in our glass, it just becomes, if you're a you know, good thinking person making the wine, you care more and more about the environment in which you're making your wine. And so there is, without a doubt, a big growth in Bordeaux. There are a lot of big properties here. It's not easy. If you've got 100 hectares, so you know, 250 acres of wine, it is not a vineyard, sorry, it's not easy to make that organic biodynamic, but we're at about 10%
Right.
now. And the great thing is the big names, Fontplegard, Ponte Canet, Parma, those guys being biodynamic are helping to make everybody else realize that this is possible here, even though we're an oceanic climate, and that you need it. For me, that's where so much of the exciting stuff is happening. In Sonoma, I love, there's so many great small biodynamic or organic producers in Sonoma and Napa. Not as many. I think Napa has really a lot of the same issues that Bordeaux does in terms of this image, this prestige. It's not always easy to refocus back purely at the vineyard level. In Napa, you're often buying fruit, you're not growing your own. So that's a problem for organic often. So it's ongoing at both sides of the ocean. But I think it's, for me, that's the future, and it's where we can get excited. It's where schools can get excited, we can get excited, and you feel this authenticity of actual relationship with the guy making the wine.
Yeah, your point about how hands-on it is and how it becomes harder to do at scale, you know, but it really is kind of the top wineries in these different regions around the world that are showing it's possible for other people to do it. But also, you know, it's important to point out a lot of other less expensive wines are realizing we can do it at cost too, that, you know, it is possible. It's just, you know, people need to work out how to do it each in their own specific case. So we are out of time.
Okay, I was going to final, but it's not so positive. Is there are definitely examples of people doing 5% of their vineyard organically, biodynamically, and then marketing about it, which is complete rubbish. You know, if you until across the whole vineyard, it's tough to talk about. But anyway.
Yeah, no, it's super important. You know, transparency and honesty in how you present yourself in your wines needs to be paramount for sure. But thank you so much again for making time. I'm thrilled to be able to bring this kind of conversation to wine. I think my hope is that we'll see more and more of this, of people, you know, who have expertise in different regions learning together by sharing information about different regions. So I really appreciate you helping us kind of get this started.
Thank you. It was really fascinating for me as well to be talking to you and to learning from you. So thank you everybody for listening, and speak to you soon.
Great, thank you.
Take care.
Bye-bye. Thank you, Elaine. Thank you, Jane. And thank you everyone for participating today. A recording of the webinar will be published to the California Wine Institute's YouTube channel in the next couple of days, and all of you participants will receive an email with the link. And remember, you can access all of the previous Behind the Wines episodes on that YouTube channel as well. So we hope you will join us next week as we continue this new chapter to the series. Elaine will speak with San Francisco Chronicle wine critic Esther Mobley and Director of Education at Pacific Union Co., Kelly A. White. The session will take place on Tuesday, September 1st at 10 a.m. Pacific. Thank you all again, and wishing you all a safe and enjoyable week.
Thank you.